I mean, since 1990, St. Louis has closed 40% of its schools, and the district has lost 55% of its enrollment. And that's just since 1990. That's not even including all of the students who transferred out of the city into suburban schools for the desegregation program. So they had one of the largest desegregation programs in the country at one point here in St. Louis, where Black students from the city were allowed to transfer into majority white schools in the suburbs, and white students from the suburbs were allowed to transfer into majority Black schools in the city, but magnet schools in the city to desegregate. But if you were a white student from the city, you could not transfer to a suburban school. And if you were a Black student in the suburbs, you could not transfer into a city school. So it was very controversial. It was always uneven, with thousands of students leaving the city and maybe a few hundred of students coming from the suburbs. And so it was really the outcome of a very contentious desegregation struggle. The state of Missouri, one of my colleagues described him as a reluctant partner. His name's Colin Gordon. He's another sociologist as well. But thinking about the role of the state in creating some of the segregation that we see today and maintaining that throughout the 80s here was just was unsettling.
I do have a question for you, because we talk about competition. You know, when I was in school, you had public school. You had public school, you had private school. Once you started seeing the privatization of school, there was a shift to, if we have these underperforming schools, we're now going to have a voucher system, and we're going to get what we call parents' choice. Did we see academic performance in those students that use those vouchers going to other schools? What did we see? What was the end result of the charter schools in their education? Was it better?
So one of the things that we found kind of collectively over these charter schools, the first charter school opened in the US in 1992. So studying charter schools over that time, especially in the early 2000s when they exploded. I mean, they were expanding, growing like 20% a year. And to put that in perspective, traditional schools would grow by less than 1% a year. So we saw this rapid growth of charter schools and this broad appeal. I mean, we have, and I kid you not, we have like the Black Afrocentrist, pro-Black folks on one end, all the way to the religious conservative on the other end, all finding space within the charter school movement, because there's this narrative: if you're dissatisfied with district schools, we have what you need. We have the flexibility. So we might not say it's a private school, but we say we focus on these three values. You know, we might not say it's a Black power school, but we focus on these three values. So everyone can find their niche in this market.
That is so true. And opponents, of course, argue that the quality of education will suffer if schools become increasingly specialized for niche audiences, because there will no longer be an emphasis on values common to all students.
The effort to privatize education, though, and other, not just education, but to private or to make these public-private hybrids within social policy, prisons, education, hospitals, even trash, you know, just these basic public services, you know, really expanding that capital in that way has been something we've been seeing since the 70s. And it's been a concerted effort to privatize public services in the name of efficiency. So we can save money. We can save money. We can do it for less. We can do more for less. And we see that when generally when you cut those corners, that whoever the clients are, those are the folks who pay. And so I think with the charter school movement, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, I think many, in the vast majority of charter schools, 7 out of 10 charter schools are opened by local actors, folks who are what we might say like a mom and pop type of charter school. So we're not talking about the big networks. But for the remaining 30%, a good share of those schools are still operated with by for-profit agencies. And so the concern becomes, what does it mean to have a profit motive in education Does that mean that you're going to find ways to find the most easy to educate students? Are you finding ways to fudge your numbers? Are you finding ways to demonstrate an effect that you don't have? So I like to say what we see with charter schools is there's not a magic charter school effect. Like traditional public schools, some are great and high performing, others are not. They close at a slightly higher rate. And surprisingly, though, the number one reason that charter schools close has to do with mismanagement. Academic performance is one of it closes for academic performance is less frequent than other reasons. So mismanagement is one of the key reasons that charter schools close, which I think is telling. Yes, it's very difficult to run a school, but at the same time, when you have public funds, you have to be accountable for those public funds. And so that's been one of the controversies around charter schools, just misspending of funds and funds that are unaccounted for. That's raised concerns within the expansion. But in terms of achievement, there were some early signs that charter schools seem to be serving more advantaged students. So it seemed like in some places when they first started, they were operating as alternatives to private schools, which is not necessarily what many state legislators wanted. But they were operating in this kind of unofficial capacity. But as they expanded, especially in cities and in some places, they were isolated. Like in Ohio, initially you could only open charter schools in what they call the Big Eight. And so in some places it was intentional. Here in Missouri, it's also been intentional because suburban and some of the more rural and ex-urban districts really view charters as a threat to their financial stability. And so this was allowed to happen in cities in terms of accelerating the decline of city districts, because when a student opts into a charter school, their tax money follows them. And so many city districts are already saying, listen, we don't have enough money to operate. We're operating at a deficit. And now charter schools are accelerating that because they're pulling students from district roles, and we don't have the money. We have the same number of classrooms or the same number of buses, but we have fewer students in those seats and fewer students taking transit. And so we're still paying those costs. I mean, that's the thing with school closures, though. Even when we have buildings closed, you don't see those cost savings without massive layoffs. So when I hear folks say, okay, we're closing buildings, but we're not going to lay off teachers because, like you've already pointed out, we have a teacher shortage, which has only gotten worse since COVID. We have a school nurse shortage, all support staff shortage, bus driver. Here in St. Louis opened the first few months of school this past year, and they told parents you have to find a way to get your students to school. We have a bus driver shortage. They sent some students on taxis. I mean, they literally did not. And this is after contracting with private bus services. And so it's just, that's why I said, I do not envy district officials. I do not envy education officials, especially at this time. However, I would be remiss not to raise the concerns about closures and to point out, I think in many respects, districts have pushed forward and operated as if there's no social loss when they make these decisions. And I don't think that's true. I think that's also accelerating the departure of many families. For me, again, if we're thinking about social cohesion, if I'm a district leader, I want families to have a great experience in my district. I want them to graduate. I want the kids to return with kids of their own and say, I had a great experience in this district. So I want to have kind of this intergenerational connection. And it's just become unfortunate that although we have all of this amazing potential in our city districts, we're just not investing.
Okay, I do want to go over this New York Times article. They reported it since 2002. 91 schools have either closed or in the process of closing. And then Chicago, of course, is proposing to close, reorganize, or consolidate 14 public schools this year. Again, urban districts, large cities, displacement of students. That is really frightening. And our parents have got to be frightened.
Absolutely.
Because you're saying that you're not even given notice. You're in class and now you're hearing, because this is now in the newspaper, and kids are thinking, well, what does that mean?
And is it my school?
Is it my school? You know, so what's that going to do to if I'm an athlete, what's that going to do to me?
Right.
We coach the athletes to, certain schools. What's my scholarship ability if I'm now a junior and I'm going to end up going to a school where nobody knows me? I may not be able to get on the team. Those are real issues. Those are real issues. Maybe not for adults, but for kids. What are you seeing in terms of any parent? What power, I guess, do parents have? Because it doesn't seem like they have a lot.
I would say, unfortunately, very little. There have been instances where parents, and so whenever we see these closures, especially mass closures discussions begin to take place, there's always considerable protests from families, communities, teachers. I mean, there's teachers union. I mean, it's pretty consistent across cases. One of the things that I saw here, for example, was folks organized to push for more transparency with respect to how these decisions are being made. But I've only seen a handful of times when schools have been spared for the result of parent protests or from community protests. So there's one school here that it's Sumner High School in St. Louis. It's a historic high school. It was the first high school open west of the Mississippi for Black students. And so it's a beautiful building, but it's an old building. And I think there are 200 students in this building that was built to accommodate 3 or 4 times that. I mean, it's a huge building, an old building. But all that to say, it took famous alumni from the school, a community coalition of education faculty, community organizers, artists, art companies here, and parents and teachers to convince the board to delay closing the school. So they have 3 years to turn this school around to the board standard. And
wow.
I respect so the superintendent who just retired from St. Louis Public Schools, I have a great deal of respect. He really helped stabilize the district. But he said in his interview with respect to their plan, I think it's going to be difficult. I don't want to pretend like this is not going to be a difficult turnaround. We are definitely going to see another wave of closures. And part of that is due to COVID. So with COVID accelerating, some of the great resignation that happened within school, many teachers are burnt out also. So that accelerated some early retirements. And so our teacher shortage has gotten worse since COVID. But then on top of that, enrollment declines from when we closed schools and went virtual to when we reopened. Many places it still hasn't recovered. And what we're finding is that many families have come up with educational co-ops, or they're homeschooling now, and they have more resources available online and available through community, and they're not returning to public schools. They don't find it necessary. They don't find that they need the support. And so that's why I say part of, thinking about those trends, and I should say this is highest, and I was surprised at how high it was, but this change was highest for Black families and has not dropped. Thought it was a short-term spike, like, when schools reopen and things return to normal, folks will return, but we did not see that. Charter schools did see growth under COVID. Some reopened, some never closed. Like I know some charter schools here that never closed when we had, when we went virtual, or I should say they didn't remain closed. They kind of they closed to socially distance and prepare the rooms, but they said the students that we serve can't afford to be on virtual learning for this extended period of time. So they said they knew their students and they stayed open, but that attracted other parents who either were dissatisfied with virtual learning or just couldn't maintain it. I mean, during that time, it was really a lot of pressure on families. I had one of my sisters-in-law had 4 kids in school at that time, and she was receiving hundreds of emails every day that she's expected to process, because there's an email for every assignment. There's an email from every teacher. She has high school students, so they have 5 different teachers. And so it was just a lot to process, and she's working at home also. And so, you're just thinking about that year and a half, really, almost 2 years where we were virtual, and the implications of that. So parents are, really worried about that as well. How do we make up for lost time?
I think there's be some interesting research that's done on this generation being out of the school systems because of COVID, and how much of that achievement gap is going to be attributed to the fact that they were home 1 or 2 years. Basically trying to make their own. And I know in this district, they thought, oh, we could, have kids learning remotely. They didn't even figure out many of these kids didn't even have internet access. Something as basic as that. Kids weren't hooked up. And I'm like, we've been talking about that forever. But it didn't get home to these districts that the kids can't even get the content. So the Chromebook means nothing.
Right.
Have the internet. Okay, I got it. And I don't think this is the trick question, but I guess I have to ask it. Many of the scholarships that you see that are available for teachers, that they forgive their loans if they come into these 4 districts. What kind of impact do you think that that's had just on education in general? I'm in this poor school, but it's only because I'm trying to get my loans paid off, and the minute that's done, I'm out of here. What's their investment? What do you think has been their investment in the actual students?
So not just that program, but there are a few other programs, which I won't name, that trouble me, but there are programs that I see as building turnover into a school. And I believe schools, we should be very intentional about making sure our schools are stable and structured places. And so those programs in general, anything that encourages someone to leave a school, in a short period of time, or to make a short-term commitment to a school, I genuinely am critical of. Well, foremost, I think that when you are an educator, that you are very much dealing with the whole person. And we have to be mindful as educators that a remark that we might say in passing can really shape how a student sees themselves or sees their capability. So they might think, oh, I'm not good at math because we didn't phrase something appropriately. And so that's a great deal of responsibility. And so I personally discourage folks from going into education who do not absolutely believe that they are supposed to be there and love working with young people or working with people whatever age, because I also like working in adult education as well. So I won't just limit this to youth, but I think that role is too important. It's just like I would tell people, I joke with my students all the time. I'm like, don't you want your doctor to be in a good mood? Like, don't you want your doctor to be rested and, feeling great, thinking clearly? I want them to be, I want my doctor to come back from vacation like, oh, I'm feeling great, and wants to be there because that's an important relationship. And I want them to have a clear mind, feel relaxed when they're dealing with me. And so I say, in the same way, I think it's my responsibility. Yeah, do I have bad days? And sometimes I don't want to teach, or sometimes I don't like the topic that we're talking about, or what have you. But I said that I need to put that aside because I've made the commitment to be here and to support your learning and to be a part of learning together. And so for me, I take that mindset when I'm evaluating policy too, and thinking about, okay, this might not be personally what I like, but is this benefiting the whole, benefiting the majority? Who is missing out? Like, what are the unintended consequences? What are the intended consequences? And I think we do so much jumping around and experimentation. I was talking to a close friend today who is an administrator at a high school in Indianapolis, and she was just sharing with me, they call it initiative fatigue. You know, folks in school, they feel like everyone's coming up with all these new initiatives of how they need to teach. No one's talking to teachers, and they've implemented a new initiative before we figured out that the last one worked. And so it's just, you know, do we have students at the center of the school or not? That's, you know, let's start there. Are young people, our students, are they at the center of the school and the school culture? Because that's foremost, that's what we're there to do. Make sure they're safe, prepared, excited, you know, but I find that a lot can get in the way of that. So even when there are excited and well-intentioned educators, they can encounter burnout. And I wish that there were ways to build in more support for our folks. But to answer your original question, I think you do more harm than good when you're in schools and you don't want to be there. I really do. I don't think you can be trusted in that capacity, because I could talk about this all day. Again, you are supposed to speak life to young people. I think we are here to set them up for new ideas and prepare them to live out their full potential, whatever that looks like. So I want to see schools, I want to see families, I want to see educators, I want to see education leaders really take that attitude and center young people and in the life of the school and make a commitment to support them and provide the resources that they need to thrive.
Now, we've talked about some of the trends where we're going to see more homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see more suburban schools. We're going to see more closures of urban schools. That's a bleak picture. Any other trends you think we can look forward to seeing?
One trend that I hope we see is more experimentation with community schooling or different approaches to community schooling. So I'm thinking here specifically with respect to what often starts out as like homeschool co-ops, but grows more into a network or more into a school. I think the grassroots efforts here, and not to romanticize it, but I think that there's room to support different type of schooling models. And I see a lot of discourse around that, particularly like in some of the groups that I'm in on social media, folks who are talking about how to create schools that are targeting Black students, for example, or schools that are targeting a diverse set of students, but are focused on closing social divides or closing the racial divide.
Professor Duncan Shippey, when I look at you and I listen to you and I hear you, you are the kind of educator that inspires, and you are the kind of educator that we want to have our children around, because I think you can just see it in your face and in your voice. You love children, you love educating, and I commend every educator out there who is in the trenches, because I know you probably don't have any more control than the parents do.
Right.
That are happening. But I think we have to applaud the ones that are in the trenches, that are sticking it out in spite of so many cataclysmic changes that are happening in your industry. I want to give you the last word. You have been so inspiring. And, you know, my daughter actually wants to be an early childhood educator. And so
awesome.
I've learned probably a whole lot more over the last couple of years, because she's still in college. And she has that same passion too. So I applaud you and all those other aspiring teachers out there. You know, don't be discouraged by all these negative metrics that you see. It's real, but we need you to be the difference. And when I look at educators like you and I talk to educators like you, I know all's not in vain. We've got some people 10 toes on the ground and they're making things happen. So what do you want to leave with our audience? Because you've just been so inspiring.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that. I think I would leave, one thing that I will leave with the audiences, and this is something that I'm learning to practice more myself. It's easy to focus on the problems, but I'm trying to focus on the problem just long enough to understand it and get around it and get to the solution. And so I think I would encourage folks, if you encounter a situation where your school is closing or where you're confused about the options that you have for enrolling your child, or you're trying to make a decision about what's next, that to really try to find as many of those resources as possible for families, whether that's through the state education office or your local district office. You are your child's most important advocate, and you know your child the best. And so you want to ensure that you have all the information possible to make the best choice for them, whether that's a district school or not. And so just keep an eye on state education policies. Your local school board election might be happening this year. I know we're having one in my district in April of this year. And so you want to check and see who is representing you and what they're talking about, and if that's in alignment with your priorities for you and your child, obviously for my public school folks. So I truly believe that we can have schools that work for everyone. We have the resources. We're the richest per capita, richest country in the world. We have the resources. It's not a resource, it's a political will and a social barriers that prevent us from doing it. But we have the resources. And so as much as I critique, I'm hopeful moving forward. And I think that while we're seeing these closures now, I'm hopeful that we see creative and amazing new opportunities emerge from this shift. And perhaps this is a transition to the next wave of education.
Well, Professor Duncan Shippey, audience, please look up her work. Phenomenal work in this space. I am just so glad that you decided to join us on Tab.
Thank you.
You're making that difference, and they say be the difference in the world.
Oh, thank you.
Difference in the world. So thank you.